Welcome to FYI with the FYMs. I'm Faith Gahende, and I work with the Office of New Student Programs here at the University of Pittsburgh to help new Panthers adjust to the transition into college life. Over the past couple of months, we have seen social justice issues come to the forefront in our communities. Today, our goal is to allow ourselves to be open, honest, and candid about the state of our world. Though this conversation is uncomfortable for most, we often see the most growth after overcoming uncomfortable situations. Listen in as we hail for change. So first of all, I want to thank our guests for being here today. I really appreciate it. I know that these conversations can be uncomfortable, especially when it comes to racism and anti-racism, but I think that it's an important conversation for all of us to have as student leaders, as well as for first-year students to kind of listen in on also as they start to navigate, life here at Pitt. So in beginning this podcast, I believe that we should probably have folks introduce themselves. So that's kind of where we want to start. Make sense? That makes sense. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to have our guests introduce themselves first, and then Ashumi and I will introduce ourselves. So we'll just start with that.
Yeah, I'm Chase. So I'm a sophomore here at Pitt, majoring in poli-sci with a minor in Chinese, and maybe political theory too, if I'm feeling ambitious later on. As of right now, I just found out about the podcast that you guys are doing through Oliver, and pretty much I've been excited to get on since.
Thank you so much, Chase. So my name is Faith. I'm a first-year mentor, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with fellow student leaders, awesome student leaders on campus.
Yes, so I can go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Matthew Jankowitz. I am currently serving as the president of the Blue and Gold Society. I'm a senior here at Pitt studying supply chain management and marketing, and I heard about this call from Ashumi. And when she told me about what we were going to be talking about today, I was really intrigued and really excited to be part of a dialogue like this. I'm super excited to be able to join you all today, and I look forward for the chat we're about to have.
And hi everyone, my name is Ashumi Rocadia, and I am also one of the first-year mentors for this upcoming school year. And I'm just really excited to talk to all of you guys about everything. And yeah, we can get started. Thanks, Faith.
Awesome. I love that. We've all introduced ourselves. So what we kind of want to do is just have a free-flowing conversation. We're going to have some questions that we've kind of collected interspersed throughout the podcast that we'll all answer at some point. So I guess I'll just start off with the first one. What's your earliest memory of being aware of racism and kind of knowing that it exists?
All right. Well, basically, when I was a freshman in high school, I lived in like a pretty insular community. There wasn't a whole lot of diversity out there. So when I was in a freshman, we had like a school-wide pep rally, and we had like one of the very, very few, black kids on the floor. He was participating in one of these games, and some hillbillies from the hills were up in the top of the pep rally, and they were shouting out racial slurs and putting it on Snapchat, and it was a huge deal. The Rolling Stones came in. They did an interview about the whole thing. The Justice Department came down, and we did a spirit program, and it was like having, doing this exact same thing. We're having a dialogue between, different people and trying to, widen our worldview, I suppose. So when that happened, I think that was probably the moment where my eyes were open and realized, even though perhaps, it's not necessarily the most obvious thing, people still experience it on a daily basis.
For me, I would say it was actually probably at a younger age. I remember I was probably around 4th or 5th grade at the time, and it was coming up on Martin Luther King Day, and we were talking about the holiday. And I know that for myself, like a lot of people who have grown up throughout the public education system in this country, sometimes the way it's portrayed is that racism was something that happened in this country. And we had the civil rights movement, and then racism was ended, and everyone has now lived in this equal society where everyone is treated the same and treated with the same opportunity. And I grew up in an area that was very diverse. We had people from all different backgrounds, all different socioeconomic statuses, all different races, all different cultures. But I think the difference between diversity and inclusion is a very big thing. I think that just because everyone is present in a room doesn't mean that they're necessarily mixing together and coming together as one and living that holistic and connected group. And I remember when we were having this conversation, the Black students in our class were being vocal about the fact that the civil rights movement happened, but it's not something that's over. and that it's something that's still happening. And I remember going home to my parents and asking them about that because I was confused. There was this notion that I had living in this more higher end community, okay, racism's over. And I talked to them and they sat me down and they had that conversation and they said it's not something that we have instilled in you, but it's something that other people believe and is still very prevalent in communities like ours and all around. And that's really the first time that I realized that racism was a thing. I would say it definitely took more time into my life to fully understand it and really see how it played out. But I would say that was my first time really interacting with the concept.
And going off of that, I think I was also very young whenever the first time I experienced racism. I know that my parents had come home from work. I forget if it was my mom or my dad, but they were just having an open dialogue about something that someone had said to them while they were at work. And at first, I kind of had very similar like viewpoints as to kind of like what you were saying, Matt, about how you thought like, oh well, I thought racism was over. Everyone can be super welcoming. We already went in like we went through all this. Like it's not going to happen anymore. And then just hearing my parents talk about it, they sat me down and they just told me that, hey, it is very prevalent still, and people are going to look at your like skin tone prior to like whenever they start talking to you, and that's something that you do have to deal with, but to not let it keep you from doing what you want to do. So that's my first experience.
Yeah, I would say for myself, like I can't necessarily pinpoint a moment when I knew that racism existed. I just can just look at kind of like my high school career, kind of like Matt was saying, and how they kind of taught it in school, and how you have those conversations in class, and then you walk outside of class, and then you're met with a situation that is very different from what they're portraying about history and portraying about the current state of our world. So I can't necessarily pinpoint a specific time, but I think it's kind of always been something that you kind of keep in the back of your mind as a person of color. It's not something that you dwell on per se, but it's definitely something that you recognize, you know, when you walk into the room and you're the only one, or when, you know, somebody makes comments about maybe a certain feature that you have or certain facial features. Like those are just things that you just kind of keep in the back of your mind on like kind of a rolling tape, if you will. So have you ever been told that discussing race is taboo or something that you shouldn't do? And if so, where do you think that belief stems from?
I can start off. So I know on multiple times that I've been told like, oh, there's no need to discuss race. It was like very much a belief back home in my community that we didn't need to discuss race. And one of those sayings that came along with it very frequently was, I don't see color. And I think it was because people were trying their best not to be racist, and they were really trying to be cognizant of that. And instead, what they were doing was they were just trying to not see race at all and kind of take away that feature, because if you aren't talking about race, then you can't be racist. And I definitely understand that perspective, and I can understand where it comes from, but I see it kind of as a walking on eggshells type of belief. I think that, as we said when we were having the introduction to this podcast, is that these conversations can be uncomfortable and they can get awkward at times. But I think when you're able to open up, and especially as someone who is white, who doesn't know what it's like to live in this country as a person of color, you just have to be honest and you have to be vulnerable and open up to people and say, I don't understand necessarily per se what it's like to walk a mile in your shoes, but I would love to have a conversation and try and get that perspective and try and get that belief. But I also can totally see why people would say, if I just don't engage in that, if I try and think on the fact that race is something that shouldn't be used as a qualification for someone's merit, so if I just don't bring it up, then I'm doing my job in not being racist.
I think going off of that, it also stems from the fact that a lot of people are scared. They're scared to say the wrong thing. And even if, like growing up as a person of color in the United States, I'm Indian. I'm not Black. I'm not, you know, another race. And so I'm never going to fully understand how other people, even though they are a minority, how they're going through racism or whatever they are going through with their heritage, their culture, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I think that's probably what I would say where it all stems from, is people are too scared to have that conversation because they don't want to throw their privilege in their face if they don't experience it, or even if you have experienced racism or any sort of discrimination, you feel that you aren't qualified enough to talk about what you have personally gone through because you can never again walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Ashimi, I think that's like a really interesting point, but I think that kind of points back to what Matt kind of said earlier in terms of it's important that we have these conversations. It's important that you sit down with people of color, with Black people, and have conversations about maybe situations that they've been in, or, you know, how to be a better ally in some ways. So I definitely think that those conversations are warranted. And I think especially at a time like now where it's being brought to the forefront in so many ways, that those conversations need to happen in friend groups, in, you know, maybe even, you know, in other places also when it comes to organizations as well. It's important to have those conversations just to, I don't want to say clear the air, but to make sure that everybody's voice is heard in those particular situations. And to also address, you know, times where people might not know what to say or might not know how to say it. I would say, have I ever been told that discussing race is taboo? What's really interesting is kind of like a juxtaposition is that it's something that we discussed, especially in my house, pretty openly. I think my parents, and I'm grateful for it, were very forthright and upfront about things of that matter. They were very upfront about the fact that, you know, there are certain things and certain things you can say and certain things that you can't say. And, you know, it's important that we show everybody respect. They were very, very big about that. So it's something that we talked about. I've never been told that it was taboo. But I can understand how in other communities, like Ashimi kind of alluded to in terms of like fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of coming across incorrectly, how it might not be something that people touch on.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw something in here that you know, I haven't necessarily been told that race is off limits. I just think that how you know, the other guests were mentioning that, you know, that people think, you know, that they haven't felt racism, and so like they assume that no one else has as well. You know what I mean? So just because, you know, they haven't walked in the shoes of someone who's a person of color, and obviously they're not going to be experiencing, you know, that, you know, the racism and et cetera, they just, you know, make the logical leap that no one has. And so I think that they say, therefore, that people that are confronting racism head on are, you know, whining, or they're making it up, or, you know, exaggerating it. So perhaps maybe I'm not being told that I can't talk about race, but people who are like, you know, in the Black Lives Matter movement are saying, oh, you know, you can't talk about race. You know, we've confronted this issue many, many times. We don't need to do it again, you know, which is obviously an incorrect assumption.
For our next question, it is, how do you think stereotypes have played a role in race relations?
Yeah, so I think that this is a tough question. I think as humans, I think something that we have to understand is that, or recognize in all of us, is that we all generalize. We all look at one person that did maybe one thing to us or didn't do one thing to us, or whatever the case may be. We saw one, or we saw this situation occur, and we had this tendency to generalize about everybody in that particular group. And that's not just limited to race. That's limited to many things. It could be about a major. Oh, all science majors, all STEM majors do this one thing or act this one way. And I think it's really important to understand that just like you would like to be treated as an individual with your own particular makeup, that it's important that we also see everybody else that way, rather than generalizing based on what we see in media, because media, as we all know, is a really important part of all of our lives at this point, whether it's social media, whether it's, you know, watching Netflix, whatever we see oftentimes are the things that we believe are real in this world. And I think it's important to, again, subtract people from the group and look at everybody individually as an individual, which is something that I think that we should already be doing. But we know, like, we're humans and sometimes we fall short.
I definitely agree with that. And I think it's a really interesting perspective. I think the stereotypes, one thing people often have is fear that they're going to affirm stereotypes of groups that they fall into. I think also another place where stereotypes often are very prevalent and can be dangerous, but people don't see it as much, is with jokes. And I think that people are always like, oh, no, it's a joke. It's not meant to be taken seriously. Oh, it's just a joke. But at the end of the day, those jokes are still going to affirm these stereotypes. And especially when you're making them when you're younger and you don't have as much ability to understand the magnitude behind them, they do a lot of harm in sort of setting standards of what people should and shouldn't be. And they, as you said, really generalize people into these buckets and not view them as an individual. I know for me growing up, I'm Jewish, and I would hear all these Jewish stereotypes. I would hear all the jokes that people would say, and it almost makes you feel like you're pinned in. It's like, is that how I'm supposed to be acting? Is that how I'm supposed to be? Is that who I really am? Or are these generalizations? And then you kind of live in fear because you don't want to be the stereotype, or like you don't want to be that token kid, but you can't help but feel it because sometimes it just comes from a lack of understanding where these stereotypes are coming from. But that's merely who you are as a person. So you feel like you get really pinned in and you don't know where to go. So I think that it can be extremely harmful. And obviously people generalize, and it's an easier thing to do, and it's a way that our brains work. But I think it really comes down to, as we see it become more and more prevalent, making sure that we're calling it out when we're seeing it and trying our best as ourselves to really get to know people as individuals, because a lot of it comes from a place of ignorance and lack of understanding.
Yeah, I just thought I'd toss in here that, I think obviously most stereotypes are negative, right? Say, oh, some people are athletic, some people, great at music, or et cetera. But there's also positive stereotypes in that, like, you say, oh, somebody's, great at accumulating wealth, or someone's great at doing math, or et cetera, stuff like that. I think that really, well, number one, the negative stereotypes are kind of like a shortcut. I feel like they're avoiding the underlying problems and just saying, okay, the reason why, this whole group is, by and large has less money than another group is because they're lazy or something, rather than, saying, oh, there's a massive police presence here, or et cetera, and all these different issues. It's so you can just skip over the underlying problem and instead just stereotype an entire group and say, oh, it's because they're this, or they fail to do that, et cetera. But then simultaneously, I think the positive stereotypes in themselves might be just as might be just as bad. I mean, it pushes, if you constantly tell somebody, oh, the best thing that you're at is athletics, or the best thing you're at is math. I mean, what are they going to assume? That, okay, my role in life is to be good at this. And so they're going to be, less inclined to go and try something different when all they know is that they're the best at, running, or they're the best at something else. And then even further than that, I think even when they do achieve, these goals, it's not necessarily their achievement, but rather something inherent in the fact that there's some race or some group. I think those two things in combination might be perhaps even more powerful than other stereotypes.
I completely agree with what you said, Chase, because whether it's a good stereotype or a bad stereotype in terms of how we view it, it's going to have negative effects on those people. Because I know that, for example, when it comes to like a certain race or a certain like culture will be good at a specific like subject, I kind of felt that if I wasn't good at that subject, that I was gonna be like letting my race down, or letting my people, if I can say that, like kind of down. And that kind of made me feel that I wasn't worthy of being that race, being like that person. That kind of made me not like hate where I came from for a little bit, but kind of made me feel like, well, did I kind of like grow up in the wrong family? Like, was I not supposed to be Indian? Was I supposed to be, someone who is better at this or better at that? And so, yeah.
But I think that these are such valid points in terms of the fact that it's so hard to put into words sometimes, but you, like Ashimi said, like you almost feel like you don't belong, or you kind of have like this weird pseudo identity crisis where you look at your life and you say, well, this is what everybody thinks I'm supposed to be, or what I'm supposed to be. And those aren't things that I enjoy. Like, there are stereotypes, about being the most athletic or having to be the most, like, what if you're not? Like, does that mean that you're no longer part of this particular community, or that you're not good enough to be in the community? So all around, stereotypes are harmful, positive, negative. They can definitely do some harm.
Absolutely.
And I don't know, this is, an observation I'm having here in the moment, but if you think about the stereotypes, for example, just of, Black youth, for example, they're by and large told, you're the best at being athletes or entertainers. I think I think we can all agree that those are professions, like statistically, the vast majority are going to fail in those professions. So if somebody chooses to make some decision, say, oh, I'm going to go try to be a rapper, I'm going to go try to, go run professional. I mean, honestly, 99.9% will not achieve that goal and end up in a worse position had they not been influenced by that stereotype in the first place.
I definitely agree. And one point that I also want to bring up is that sometimes these stereotypes become so prevalent that they also start getting enforced inside your own communities. And that usually when we talk about stereotypes, we look at people looking outwards and putting an assumption on you and pressing them on you. And I think sometimes they can even become so prevalent that everyone in that group has just come to accept it and think that that's the way of life. And now if we want to be a good member of our community, that is what we do. And when you want to go against that, now all of a sudden everyone feels like you're not proud of your community, or you're trying to go against that, or you're trying to be something that you're not. So especially with those positive stereotypes, Chase, that you were talking about before, it's like, oh, well, it's expected that you're going to go on and be this profession, or you're going to be good at this. And when you go and you talk to the older people in your community and say, you know what, I know that a lot of people do this, but I'm actually interested in trying something different. I want to try X instead of Y. They go, why are we not good enough for you? Are you not proud of where you're coming from? Are you not proud of who you are? And it really forces you to think about, well, what does it mean to be a good member of my community? Or why is it that my community wants that? And obviously, they're never trying to mean anything harmful by it, but it's so often you almost feel like the stereotypes just become expectations and what they are. And it's, if that's all you see around you in the media and in the representations of where you're looking to find yourself, if that's all you see, then you feel like that's all you know and that's all you can be. That obviously these stereotypes are very harmful, but when it's all you're interacting with, it's all you come to know and the only place you can really see yourself.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, I think perhaps even I think the fact that they've been so integrated into the, communities, like you just mentioned, it might be evidence of the fact that perhaps they're even harder to confront than a negative stereotype. I think most people would agree that perhaps, saying something outright is probably saying a negative stereotype outright is going to be pretty quickly classified as, either a bigot or, racist and, ignorant person. If you say something positive about like a positive stereotype, I don't think whether or not most people will necessarily have that instantaneous gut reaction. This is something that is, inherently bad. But, perhaps there'd be, some internal debate before they even decide whether or not it was something good or bad. I think at least that's my view on it.
Yeah. Well, that was great. I love that. That was amazing. I definitely agree with all of you. Yeah, that's a really great one. So the next question we kind of have here is, what does allyship look or sound like to us? I would say that it probably starts out by listening. I think that what's been interesting about this time that we've kind of all been living through is that this was one of the first times that I actually felt heard by friends, by people in my community. Not that they had brushed me off in the past, just there was no motivation in some ways to have the conversations and to say what I meant and mean what I say, because I just didn't feel like anybody was listening. And now we're in a time where listening is so important and people are actually taking the time to do so. So I would definitely say listening.
I definitely agree with the listening part. And I think it's also making sure that you are listening when the people you are trying to be an ally need someone to speak to and they need to feel heard. It's also not continuously prying at them to get information. Obviously, in order to be a good ally, you need to be educated on the conversation. Before you're going to get up there and be a supporter and be an advocate for a group of people, you need to really understand what they're coming from and understand the struggles that they're facing and understand the objectives that they are trying to get out of the moment and the time that they're in. But that doesn't mean that you should just go to your friends in the community and continuously hammer questions at them. Obviously, if they come to you and say, hey, I need to talk to, then you should drop everything and listen. And if here and there you have a question and you want to get their perspective on it, they are going to be very appreciative of the fact that you are reaching out and trying to be making sure that you are getting the facts and getting the perspective and getting people's opinions on it. But there are a lot of resources out there and resources that you can use that aren't going to drain your friends. There are books, there are news articles that are coming out, there are forums, there are blogs, there are articles, and there are a lot of great places to turn to find that information. Because whenever you're in a fight or something where you're really trying to get something, if you're in a minority community and you're really trying to be heard, it's a very important thing to do, but it also can be a very draining thing to feel like you're constantly talking and constantly fighting for what you just feel should be something that is given to everyone under the concept of equal rights. That then having to continuously be that piece of education for your friends is just going to add to that. And another thing is really making sure that you aren't the person that is controlling the narrative. As an ally, you are there to support, you are there to help, and you are there to advocate. But it's not your position to decide where the movement's going to go. It's not your position to decide what the end game is. It's your responsibility to really understand the group that you're trying to support and do everything that you can to help with that. I know, especially as a straight white male in America, I am granted a certain amount of privilege that a lot of my peers don't see. And I know that sometimes people want to be ashamed of their privilege or push their privilege away, but it's something that you have to understand is just understated and unfortunately cemented into society right now. And if you have that privilege, use it to help the people around you. If you know that you come in a position where your lawmakers and your representatives and the people of the administration around you are going to be more likely to listen to you, use your voice to point the attention to other people. Use that platform to make sure that what needs to be said is getting said and who needs to be heard is getting heard, and really making sure that you are always in the driver's seat and you are always there helping, making sure the movement's going forward, but you're never trying to be in the spotlight or the one that's driving what's happening.
Add to that, Matt, that's a very good point that you shouldn't be the one kind of like driving everything, because you're never going to be able to fully understand what everyone's going through. And so I feel that a lot of times whenever, especially recently, whenever I find, like I'll be in a conversation with a group of friends and I'll see a few people trying to relate to someone who's a minority, who is not a minority. And that's something that, you can't say something like, oh, well, I remember one time that I felt like edged out of a conversation. But yeah, you may have been edged out, but it wasn't because of your race. And if it was, maybe express that, but not necessarily, like that's not what you should be doing in terms of how you can show your support. Just listening, I think, is the most powerful thing you can do right now, because trying to show support in that sense where you say like your personal experience, it kind of takes away from what the person who is trying to tell you what they're going through is like going through, if that makes sense. So I would say just listen and give them that little bit of support they need, or a lot of the support that they need right now.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Matt was saying, that you need to amplify their voice. I completely agree. I mean, again, it seems like I always have the hot takes here, but I do think that there's a really fine line between amplifying someone's voice and just being like being basically like a surface level ally. Like you're posting the black square on your Instagram, like you're showing up, you're retweeting like the most popular tweets, but in all reality, like you're not actually interacting with the reality of being a true ally, right? I mean, you're not recognizing your privilege. You're not even taking a step back and realizing perhaps, I've done things in the past that would indicate that I'm not the best ally. Maybe I should, look at apologizing to that person that I did this to, et cetera. Just stuff like that, being willing to listen to this podcast, for example, little plug, maybe, having difficult conversations like this, these are things that a true ally is more than willing to do. And in fact,
also,
is,
allyship is not
to
a
do,
trend.
perhaps.
It should not just be something that you do when something bad happens. It should be something that you support others like all the time, not just whenever you were supposed to post that black square, or whenever a murder happens or something horrible happens in the United States, where it gets kind of put in the spotlight, but all the time.
Yeah, just going off that point, I think that it's very easy to want to be an ally and show that you're there and vocalize that support when something happens that puts a conversation in the forefront of people's minds, because it reminds you of what's going on. But at the end of the day, whether these things that are happening in society that remind us are happening or not, the fight for equal rights, the fight to end racism, it's a constant struggle. And whether you see it happening or not, it's still there. And sometimes it's at the head of the media, but it's on us as allies to make sure that it's consistently at the forefront of the conversation and giving it the momentum that it needs. Because when people see that people not affected, that aren't in that group, are willing to speak up for it and be vocal about it and show that they care about it, that's what keeps the media's attention. That's what keeps politicians' attention. And that's what keeps society's attention. So we see that we can make these amazing demonstrations. We see that we can make change. But over time, that morale and that energy around the conversation, it tapers out. and things seem like the media cycle starts to change and it loses its energy. It's on us as allies to make sure that we are keeping the attention on it, because we are the ones that are needed to make sure that the attention gets there in the first place.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. So we're rounding out here with kind of our last question. This is more Pitt specific. So Pitt is a very diverse campus with people from every walk of life represented. What advice would you give to students that may be interacting with people different from themselves for the first time?
Start this question off. I think the big thing is kind of a summary of what we all just said through this entire podcast is listen and just take that time to learn about the people that are in your pod, in your room, and the people that you meet outside of what your friend group was in high school. Because I know that whenever I had a very select few very good friends in high school, but they all generally looked the same. And I kind of felt that when I came to school that I wanted to learn about different cultures and learn about different people. And now being a senior in not high school, being a senior in college, I feel that I've gained such an amazing network of diverse and amazing people. And so putting myself out there was probably the best thing I think I could have done in my last 3 years of college and my last year. So I would just say listen to others and take that time to actually realize that the people you met in high school, whether you came from a very diverse high school or not, that you are going to be faced with so many people and they all have very unique stories.
I definitely agree with that. And I think another thing is making sure that you're approaching everything with an open mind and not trying to just go off the perspectives that you've heard of in the media or in your community back home. I know that for myself, when I came to Pitt, I had a pretty decent amount of people tell me that I was the first Jewish person that they ever met. And that is going to be something that you experience when you come here. There are so many people from so many different backgrounds and races and ethnicities. And it's really a great opportunity to learn and get to understand different cultures. There's going to be very time in your life you'll have the opportunity to interact and connect with people from so many different and diverse lifestyles and cultures. So when it comes to it, try and learn as much as you can. If you are curious about a different background or culture, if you go in and you ask the questions, people are going to be appreciative because they see of the fact that you're trying to do what you can to learn about their group and not just fall into those stereotypes that we were talking about before. And also, Pitt has a plethora of cultural organizations on campus that you can interact with. And quite often they put on programs that showcase that culture and showcase what elements of pride they have in their community. And you can go there and you can use those again as an opportunity to learn. You can hear about what makes them who they are. You can see the foods that they eat, and you can really get to learn about all those different cultures, and you can share yourself with that, and you're going to grow so much as a person. And don't feel afraid to ask questions. If you go into it and say, hi, I'm here, I'm curious, and I want to learn, people are going to open up and have that conversation because people love to talk about themselves. That's just part of human nature. So if you go into it with curiosity, people are going to love to engage with you and hear more. So just make sure that you're always trying to learn new things and not go off of those preconceived notions you might have before you come here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, everyone here, we're just, a bunch of people. We got brains just like everyone else. I mean, generally, I think we're all pretty, normal people, pretty nice. I think on average, thankfully, right? And I think number one, I mean, that's probably the most important thing is that it's not every conversation has to be a discussion on race. Not every conversation has to be some deep-seated, conversation. I mean, you can just be meeting somebody, at Shenley. You can be meeting somebody in Prosvar. It can be a simple, chit chat. It doesn't have to be always a deep conversation. And even those short ones, I think, have a real opportunity to grow as an individual. Be able to expand your cultural beliefs. Get an idea of what it's like to be somebody else. And it doesn't, again, not every conversation has to be one where you need to, sit down and prep for an hour ahead of time before you have it. I think most people are more than willing just to have a, hey, how are you? Good. How are you? You know what I mean? It's not a huge deal once you're out here. I think everyone here is more than willing to have a conversation.
Agree. I would agree with all of you in saying that it's important to be open-minded. It's important to just kind of come to the table. I'm not really expecting anything, not already putting people in boxes or stereotyping, as we kind of talked about earlier. I think it's important to come through with an open mind. I wanted to kind of open the floor for any last thoughts, if there are any. Well,
Yeah,
if not, but go ahead.
I just want to thank you for having me on this discussion again. I think that this was a really great opportunity. I hope that everyone that's listening was able to get something out of this. I know that I was able to learn a good bit listening too. And I think this shows that really open and casual conversation has such a big impact. And it doesn't have to be something that feels intense or feels like it's researching or feels like it's prying. You really can just open up and have a conversation with people and get to know so much. And I hope that all of you are able to take that and just have a conversation with someone new, interact with something you've never interacted with before, and most importantly, just be open-minded. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for having me.
But with that being said, we appreciate all of our guests for being here. We know, as always, this is an uncomfortable conversation, and we're very, very grateful that all of you were able to get on this call with us and be so honest, open, transparent, and frank about, just the way our world is right now. I also want to, just thank the people that are also listening to this. Thank you for listening to this and actually taking the time to listen to this and hopefully learn from this as well. But with that being said, we're going to sign off. So thank you so much, and hail to Pitt.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of FYI with the FYMs. Stay tuned for more episodes on topics like studying tips, career preparation, and even exploration of Pittsburgh, featuring other amazing guests and first-year mentors. Hail to Pitt!